Michael talked about this building as a machine in gardens. It's actually one of the greatest iconic modern structures of its time. Clearly it deals with a level of transparency from the inside to the outside, where there's a blurring of the lines of the inside and the outside. And there's a very simplification in terms of the detailing and the materials used, a true sense of honesty. At the same time, the campus deals with balance versus symmetry. In dealing with that, this is a test. A lot of transparency. In dealing with that, the challenge that we face is how does one take a building that was designed for some 50 member states and respond to the needs of the 21st century when there's actually 192 member states with increased population in terms of demand and need of sustainability and demand and need in terms of new ways of operating and functioning within the internal space of the building, yet for a building that wasn't originally designed to respond to that. So for that reason, it's no surprise that when we look at the project goals, the first goal is preserve the existing building as much as possible. And obviously deal with elements of the building as such as, maintaining code and upgrading to code and responding to sustainability, the energy conservation, bringing it up to 50% utilization of energy versus 100% of where it is now. And then obviously dealing with elements of the new workforce and flexibility. So as we move forward, what we'd like to do is take a quick look at how one responds to the existing building. Clearly, if you look at the existing building, there's a level of infrastructure on the exterior. There's a 550-foot wall of stone, and that stone is carried throughout the interior of the building. As you can see, at the reception desk, which is the original reception desk, it's stone. The walls of the main lobby is all stone, right down to how the column sits onto the stone of the flooring. The detailing was phenomenal on this building. Also looking at the exterior, with the glass. The glass in this building was actually clearer than it is now. There was a film that was placed over the years to deal with glare. But the level of glass in the building carries all the way through the interior. It carries through the lobbies, where you have an expansive space at the main lobby area. It carries through the escalator areas, where you can see the glass and pure form of the escalators, and even into the interior spaces at the office environments. When one looks at the ceilings, all of the public spaces have plaster ceilings. Yet, all of the private spaces have a one-by-one metal grid ceiling. Looking at the lighting for the most part is a uniform grid of lighting. In all the public spaces, it's allowed to deal with a little bit more tenacity in terms of how one responds to lighting. Because on the upper floor, it's a 1x4. Down below, you see a series of the 4x4 and a circular lighting. And then one looks at the level of metal in the building. Clearly, the curtain wall is metal and glass. That level of metal transitions all the way through the interior, whether it be at the elevator lobbies, whether it be at the glass stick system in the office fronts, or whether it be at the little details of the registers that sit on top of the convector units. The use of wood is fairly minimal, but when it is used, it's dealt with as a common, simple plane of wood. Very simple in detail. When one looks at the flooring for the most part in the public spaces is terrazzo. There's this checkerboard pattern of terrazzo everywhere you look within the common zones that connect all the various buildings together. Yet, when you get up to the upper levels, it's VAT. You get into some of the conference rooms and it's carpet. Paint, for the most part, is fairly benign. It's served as a background. But as you can see, there's a couple of areas on the main public spaces where paint is used as a modern plane. Where one wants to highlight a plane, color was used to do that fairly effectively. There's what I call the other areas. It's It's the little details such as how one mounts the clock in the stone, or how, you can see in the right photograph on the bottom, how a column actually drops down and hits the terrazzo. Very carefully, half on the white and half on the black. A lot of attention to the detail. Now, when we look at a building that was designed well over 60 years ago, it's actually about 35 years beyond its natural life. And we have existing conditions such as fuse boxes that I don't even have in my home. Cabling that was never disbanded. We look at the asbestos in the building. When one looks at the perimeter wall that's behind the curtain wall, it's laden with asbestos. The piping, the chill water piping is laden with asbestos. There was a study done a few years ago that said if the asbestos would actually have an explosion in the steam line, there'd be a 5 to 10 block containment area within the zone around the UN. Not a happy picture. And then there's technology. I think if you look at the image on the left, that's what technology should be. The image on the right, that's what exists in the UN today. I think that was in the era when they made black and white TV before color came on. Then you look at the interior space. Obviously, with the perimeter offices, there's very little natural light in the UN. The views are very limited. Circulation is fairly poor. As a result of that, it's a very inefficient and inflexible environment. So, when we look at a typical plan, just to give you a sense of orientation, the top is the river, the bottom is First Avenue, the left is the north, and the right is the south. The north and the south are the stone walls, the top, which is the east, and the bottom, the west, which is the glass. Clearly, looking at the core sort of hits the west glazing area and creates a very difficult environment internally. It actually creates a series of dead-end zones as one circumvents the core. And when one looks at the core in terms of the inefficiency of it, it doesn't have adequate mechanical systems, it doesn't have adequate telecommunication systems. Obviously, the restrooms are all ADA non-compliant. When one looks at circulation, this is a typical zone within the UN floodplain. Circulation is fairly circuitous. To find your way around is incredibly difficult. And limited views and limited light horizons because of the nature of the perimeter offices and the core that blocks a lot of the heat. This building was efficient for its time. When it was built, closed offices were the norm. Right now, the UN has 8 office sizes. 6 of them are closed offices, 2 for the most part are workstations. And when you look at the existing facility, the image on the left was the original building. The image on the right is today. Nothing's changed. And the reality is that most of those walls were the housing and petitions that were put in 60 years ago that were designed to be dismantleable. Nothing's really changed. The building was designed to the 1938 building code, which means it's non-ADA compliant. It means there are no sprinklers in the building. And it also means that there are no fire-stopping zones on the perimeter, no fire-stopping zones within the core. They still have what was designed for its time in a paper environment, the mail sheets. And we all know what happens when you run a mail sheet for 40 stories when there's a fire. Not nice things. The one thing that is fairly robust in this building is the structure. When we looked at the structure, we tested it for seismic, and we tested it for lateral loading, for wind, and it complies with the New York City building code. However, when we look at the exterior curtain wall that Bob will talk about in a minute, it needs some hardening to respond to that. And when we look at the infrastructure that Keith will talk about, it needs some hardening to respond to that as well. So we stepped back and said, what can this building be to accommodate the future? When we look at the building of yesteryear, it worked. When we look at the building of tomorrow, it does not work. So we took a quick look at the demographics of the UN, which houses obviously the baby boomers in the 45 to 60 zone. They're all about working hard, getting in early, and staying late. We look at the Generation X category, which is the 30 to 45 bracket. They're looking for a balance of work and life. Then we look at what I call the millennials, the Generation Y. There's an integrated style of balance in life. So when we look at the UN, it has to house all these types of people that respond to a different way of operating. Obviously, the latter will be happy in Starbucks, the prior wants to have the corner office. Then you layer on top of that cultural diversity, 192 states. The US, Europe, they're familiar with open planning environments. A lot of the other nations are not accustomed to that. So how does one respond to it? So we took a quick look at the demographics of what office environments would typically be. Looking at the left, which is more of the UN, which is perimeter offices, secretary stations right outside, dedicated conference rooms that nobody can use. Then we went all the way to the right, which is more alternatives in terms of the dot-com environment, where there's hoteling, mobile workers, etc. And we realized that the UN probably falls more within the middle to the right, where the new environment needs to be more of a universal plan, fewer perimeter offices, more open plan environment with conference rooms that are not dedicated, high concentration of amenity spaces. Once you take offices away, something has to be given back. So the question is, what is the new normal? When we have to deal with a level of efficiency, when we have to deal with a level of change, when we have to deal with a level of introducing new technology, and we have to deal with a level of how do we provide an environment for tomorrow that will be acceptable for the next 60 years so we don't redo it. So the first thing we looked at is how do we improve adjacencies? Obviously, after a long period of time, people tend to migrate to offices that are available versus in offices that are exactly where their teams need to be. So we created an infrastructure that allowed us to respond to a level of vertical adjacencies, starting with the mechanical zones, which are in 4 separate quadrants, and then down below that, all the support space, the meeting areas that would house the base of the building. Then we looked at a layering system of how we respond to conferencing. Conferencing, for the most part now, is dedicated. We're looking at a strategy in the UN where conference room, for the most part in the large rooms, are not dedicated. And we located each of those rooms at the top of each elevator bank, so everyone would have one elevator ride max to get to one of these zones. And then in between, we added the office space. Then looking at the core, which is fairly inefficient, there's a joke at the UN which says the restroom, which is facing the edge of the west wall, has the best views because it is the only one that can actually capture space which has opportunities to look through Manhattan. Obviously the core is very inefficient and has dead-end corridors and it's fairly bulky. So our strategy was to look at all of the amenities required to improve the core, to include elements of new technology, which you'll see in green, to include life safety zones, which were identified in yellow, and new mechanical zones identified in pink, and obviously occupancy zones for stairs, for elevators, for new toilets, for copy and recycling centers that are part of the new environment. Then we looked at how does one create better adjacencies on a typical floor. So rather than having the rat warren of corridors and perimeter offices, we defined it into 2 zones. There's a public zone, which you'll see in the beige, and there's more of a private zone, which you'll see in blue. And then further breaking that private zone down, we identified high wall zones, which are at the perimeter wall areas. So if one wanted to build a high wall, they'll build them at the wall areas and not along the window line, so we can maintain the view corridors. Now, when I think of the UN, I think of them as the pit stop at the Indy 500, because they often get called on to deal with crises at a moment's notice. And that level of crises needs to respond to an increase in population. A good example of that is Haiti. When Haiti happened, they had to generate a lot of activity internally in terms of bringing people together. And how do they bring hundreds of people together at a moment's notice if the building can't respond to them? So one of the first things we did is we looked at the standards. We collapsed the standards, which were 8, into 4, of which 2 are high wall, 2 are open plan. And for the most part, they will remain in open plan. Then we looked at how does that apply to a typical floor plan. So as you can see in the top plan, for the most part, it's perimeter offices blocking views. In the bottom plan, the edges are high wall, the inbound spaces, for the most part, are open plan environment. And as you can see on the low-rise, mid-rise, high-rise, as one moves through the tower, there's more open plan as you rise to the top of the building. And this slide is near and dear to my heart because no matter what we do at the UN, change is the rule. We can walk into a meeting on Monday and Tuesday, it's going to change. So that tells me that the building needs to respond to some level of flexibility as the UN changes because they change at a moment's notice. So when we looked at the lower level, you can see where it's for the most part open plan, we realized that somewhere along the line, someone's going to populate the environment with high wall zones. So we created a strategy that allowed that to happen, where we can provide high wall zones if somebody actually needed it along the perimeter of the window wall. But one must maintain open space in between there to allow for view corridors and light corridors as you move up to the tower. We also took it to another level. We looked at the work zone. For the most part, the interior field is open plan environment. And we created what we call a work wall strategy or a desking strategy, which allows for the most part, open plan environment. But what you can see what blue zones are, that can either be a 36-inch high or a 60-inch high wall unit that houses technology, houses infrastructure, it can house file cabinets, storage bins, etc., in a way that everything along it slides up and down until it becomes very flexible. As you can see in the next dimension on the right, the work wall zones can be a little higher, but everything around it slides back and forth. On the left, AXO is for the most part desking environment. On the right side is an introduction of conference areas that can give people more conferencing zone within their own office space. And taking the same module, it can be a conference room, it can be a desking, or what we call a workplace zone that allows for many people to ramp up very quickly in the middle for 8 people, or it could be a combination of both, which gives them plenty of flexibility as they move forward. Now, communication at the UN is key. And when we looked at how one communicates, we clearly realized that conferencing was the hot button. Everyone said they needed more conference space. And when we looked at it, we realized that, as in any organization, if you have a conference room for 20 people, there's 2 people sitting in a room. You multiply that by 40 floors, that's a lot of real estate that's not being used. So what we did is we came up with a strategy where we define large conference zones within the building, as I described before, at each elevator drop-off point. It's a scheduled zone. You need a conference room, you need to schedule it. However, on each floor, there are middle-size, medium rooms, there are small rooms that can be used on a floor-by-floor basis. And then scattered throughout, we provided other opportunities for people that may have lost their conference space in their private office for what we call soft meeting space, casual, informal meeting space, or what we call touchdown environment. Most conversations usually happen as one moves to a work environment, and it's kind of nice to have an environment that responds to that. So when one looks at a typical floor plan, layering on top of that, where we have the offices, perimeter or inbound, we then populated it with a number of types of conference zones, so it enables one to have more of a collaborative environment versus a very stale environment which exists presently at the UN. Typical example of an open place high wall zone, reflecting the modularity of the exterior of the building, and a typical example of the interior space, using the work wall environment, which allows for an open plan zone for the most part, or you can populate it with some high offices along the perimeter. Now, this slide is actually near and dear to my heart as well, because this is a day in the life of one of the IT people at the UN. Whenever you're renovating a building of this magnitude, technology is paramount, and how does one respond to technology in a building that really wasn't designed for it? And as we look at the structure The reality is we really need 14 feet floor to floor to get everything we need to get into this building. We only have 12 feet. And then when you start layering on vertical elements such as elevators and shaft space that infuse this building, and then looking at more vertical and horizontal distribution in terms of telecommunications, data, chill water lines, condenser water lines, and then you start looking at mechanical systems and distribution and lighting, you have a very packed zone that you have to respond to. And the end result is an environment that's sort of a machine within a machine. It's a very complex set of engineering systems that need space. Very complex set of engineering systems that need structure to support it. So one of the things we did is we looked at a master plan that had to respond to it. Both vertically with all the various rises that run through the building, through 40 floors, and horizontally in terms of how does one create stratospheres of zones that respond to particular pieces of mechanical and structure as you move through the building. Now when we look at the structure is incredibly dense. And the girders run up to 36 inches in depth, and the beams are 24 inches in depth. So the reality is the only way to get a floor-to-floor height that we need is to run through the steel. So rather than running underneath, we set stratospheres of mechanical zones through the steel in some areas, with other elements running below. As you can see from the axonometric, the ductwork in some cases penetrates the steel members. A lot of these penetrations exist, and we're capitalizing on them where we can. Below the steel will be cable trays, sprinkler lines, lighting fixtures. So there's clarity in zones in terms of where does the steel belong, where does the mechanical belong, where does everything else belong. And the end result, we find, is that we can create an environment that obviously has social responsibility, clearly sustainable, in a way that we can look at light as one of the key factors of sustainability. This building has a perfect footprint to respond to light. As you can see, most of the yellow zones, which are about 90% of the floor plate, allows us to harvest as much light as possible. The zones that are in black are either telecommunications closets that don't have opportunities for glazing. The window wall offices obviously are open plan. The north and south wall offices have glass on. So everybody has an opportunity to look at light. And as you can see from the section, the ceiling is fairly packed. However, we're embarking on continuing with the splay at the window wall, which actually runs to the top and bottom of the floor slab to maximize light coming into the floor plate. It also helps with the views. Along the perimeter of the building, we're maximizing the height at 9'6", which is an enormous task in a building that's only 12 feet floor to floor. Most of the open plan area is 9'1", and around the core it's 8 feet. Most buildings of this era that are 12-foot floor to floor height have 8 foot as a typical floor height. So the views off to the river are fantastic, off to the east. The views right down 42nd Street are fantastic. Why can't we see those? So now that we have a lot of light, we looked at opportunities of reducing energy. And one of the first things we looked at is the foot candle level in the UN. Right now they're looking at 65 to 70 foot candles typically. We're cutting it in half because we have a lot of natural light to respond to. And then we took it one step further. The middle zone in the lavender color has fixed output ballasts. However, along the east and west facades, we have daylight dimming ballasts. So when the sun moves around the building, the light will modulate along with it. Same thing would apply to the exterior window wall. When the sun moves around the building and lights dim up or down, we then have the exterior window treatment that modulates with that as well, so it works in unison. And obviously, from a sustainability standpoint, we are dealing with materials where we can respond to the existing character of the building. We're providing areas of collection and recyclables for storage, so everything is clearly defined and dealt with. We're looking at reuse of materials where possible. The lighting fixtures are being looked at to be reused and reballasted. We're looking at the materials where possible to recycle them. We're looking at rapidly renewable materials in terms of how can we deal with that better, like linoleum. And we're looking at elements of the building such as certified wood. It will all be certified by FSC. And we're looking at low emitting materials where there will be low VOCs within the building where possible. And we're also looking at how do we respond to all the waste, because there's going to be a lot of waste in this building, especially from the glazing systems and the mechanical systems, and how do we actually track that and recycle it. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Keith Fitzpatrick, who will enhance upon the mechanical systems and the level of infrastructure that we have to place within this building.